Well, hello and welcome back to the Berean Way, a channel where we strive to be as the Bereans, searching the Scriptures daily in pursuit of genuine biblical truth. And I'm glad you've taken the time to join us today. And so if this is your first time with us, then welcome to the family. And to our faithful viewers who have been on this journey with us, we just thank you for your continued support and encouragement, because it probably means more than you really know. And so if the Berean Way has been adding any value to your walk, then help us keep the content coming. Subscribe, hit the like button, turn on the notifications, and pass this along to a friend who is hungry for some solid biblical teaching. And those simple actions make a bigger difference than you might even think. And also, for those of you who have reached out wanting to contribute financially, thank you for even asking. Our Buy Me a Coffee account, it's linked in the description box below. And if you feel led to give, just know it's deeply appreciated, and every dollar does find its way back into the ministry. And so today, we are now at part 3 of our series, New Carts or Ancient Paths. And before we step into today's teaching, allow me to just briefly review what we've covered in the previous teachings that has brought us to this point. Now, in part 1, we opened with the sobering account of King David's first attempt to transport the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. And he was surrounded by tens of thousands of praising Israelites and was driven by sincere zeal. But David placed the Ark on a new cart, copying the Philistine method rather than following the precise instructions Yahweh had prescribed through Moses in the Torah. And the oxen, they stumbled at the threshing floor, and a man named Uzzah, he reached out his hand to steady the ark, and Yahweh struck him dead on the spot. And the celebration, it ended in great tragedy and confusion. The lesson was painful, but it was unmistakable. Sincerity, unity, and enthusiasm are no substitute for obedience to Yahweh's specific instructions. And then in part 2, we followed David through the 3 months of silence and searching that followed. He went back to the Torah. He identified the failure when he said, "We did not seek Yahweh about the proper procedure." And he rebuilt the entire procession from the ground up. The correct Levitical families, they were assembled and consecrated, and they carried the ark on their shoulders with the poles exactly as Moses had commanded. The ark had arrived in Jerusalem with great joy, sacrifice, and national blessing. And we then introduced the cry of the prophet Jeremiah, where he said, "Stand by the roadways and look, ask about the ancient paths, which is the way to what is good, then take it and find rest for yourselves." And we introduced this as the theological and prophetic center of this entire series. And today in part 3, we're going to step fully into Jeremiah's world, if you will. But we're not going to rush past it just to get to the application. We're going to slow down and really understand who this prophet was, what generation he was sent into, and what the spiritual and historical crisis looked like from the inside. Because that context, it's what gives Jeremiah's call to the ancient paths the full force and urgency it deserves. And you cannot rightly feel the weight of an invitation to return until you understand the depth of the drift that made the invitation necessary. And so just to give some context to what we're going to present in this teaching, I'm going to read a few verses from Jeremiah 6, which we'll then unpack in this lesson. We're going to begin with Jeremiah 6, verse 1, where he says, "Flee for safety, descendants of Benjamin. Flee from Jerusalem. Blow the ram's horn in Tekoa. Light the signal fire at Beit Hakarim. For disaster looks down from the north, and great destruction. Though she is beautiful and delicate, I will destroy the daughter of Zion. Shepherds will come against her with their flocks. They will pitch their tents around her. Each will graze in his own area. Prepare for war against her. Rise up. Let us attack at noon. Woe to us, for the day is passing. The evening shadows grow long." Now jump down to verse 10 of Jeremiah 6, where it says, "Who can I speak to and give such a warning that they will listen? Look, the word of Yahweh has become contemptible to them. They find no pleasure in it. So I am full of the wrath of Yahweh. I am weary of holding it in. Pour it out on the children in the street and on the gathering of the young men as well. Both husband and wife will be captured, the old and the very aged." Now jump down to verse 13 of Jeremiah 6, where the text says, "For from the least to the greatest of them, everyone is gaining profit dishonestly. From prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have treated my people's brokenness superficially, claiming peace, peace, when there is no peace. Were they ashamed when they acted so abhorrently? They weren't at all ashamed. They didn't even know how to blush. Therefore, they will fall among the fallen. I will punish them. They will collapse, says Yahweh." Now, Jeremiah 6 is not a theological lecture that is delivered from a comfortable distance. It is a prophetic cry that is issued during a critical situation that requires immediate action. And the nation of Judah was standing in the shadow of the most catastrophic judgment in her history. And this was the fall of Jerusalem and the 70-year Babylonian exile that we're talking about here. And Yahweh, in a great display of mercy, he was still calling his people back before the hand of judgment fell. And so to read Jeremiah chapter 6, verses 16 through 19, the call to the ancient paths, if you will, without first understanding the crisis that produced it, it's like reading a doctor's prescription without even understanding the diagnosis. And the prescription, it may still be read, but it will not be felt with the same urgency. And so today, we're going to sit with the diagnosis, if you will, and we're going to understand who Jeremiah was. We're going to look at what Judah was like from the inside and what the storm gathering on the horizon actually represented. Then next week in part 4, we will stand at the crossroads of verse 16 and hear the call itself with the full weight it deserves. So let's begin. Now, I believe before we can hear Jeremiah's message rightly, we must understand the man who was commissioned to deliver it. And he didn't step into a comfortable role during a season of national revival, but he was thrown into the most painful period of Judah's history, and he was given a message that the vast majority of people refused to receive and sustain through more than 4 decades of opposition, rejection, and physical danger, because Yahweh had chosen him for precisely this moment before he drew his first breath. So let's look at this prophet appointed before his birth and the weight of his sovereign calling. Now, Jeremiah's commissioning is among the most personal and probably the most sobering in all of Scripture. Yahweh doesn't just assign him a task, but he reveals a purpose that preceded Jeremiah's existence, a calling, you might say, that was sort of woven into him before he was even formed in the womb. So let's look at Jeremiah 1 verse 4, where the text says, "The word of Yahweh came to me. I chose you before I formed you in the womb. I set you apart before you were born. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." Now, Jeremiah's immediate response here was genuine inadequacy, and I would argue probably rightfully so. But he protested that he did not know how to speak and that he was simply too young. And Yahweh's answer, he didn't dismiss the hesitation and just simply override it with authority, but he met it with a promise that he would put his own words in Jeremiah's mouth and his presence would accompany the prophet to every place that he was sent. Look at Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 9. "Then Yahweh stretched out his hand, touched my mouth, and told me, I have now filled your mouth with my words. See, today I have set you over nations and kingdoms." Notice this, to uproot and to tear down, to destroy and demolish, to build and to plant. And so the reach of this commission, if we really think about the scope of this, it's incredible. Jeremiah was not a regional minister assigned to a local congregation. He was set over the nations and kingdoms, literally, because what Yahweh was about to do through Babylon would reshape the entire ancient Near East. And his calling, it contained both destruction and construction, tearing down what had been built in deviation from Yahweh's ways and then planting the seeds of what would eventually rise from the ruins. And notice also here what Yahweh did not promise him. He did not promise comfort, popularity, or even the satisfaction of a responsive audience. The commissioning carries within it the full weight of what the calling would cost. And when Jeremiah speaks the words of Jeremiah 6, when he cries out to Judah to stand, to look, and to ask for these ancient paths, he's not offering his own spiritual insight. He's delivering the very words of Yahweh placed in his mouth by divine appointment. And that's not a minor detail, friend. It is the entire basis of the authority behind the call of Jeremiah. So let's now take some time to understand the duration of his painful ministry. Now, Jeremiah, he was called to prophetic ministry in approximately 627 BC, during the 30th year of King Josiah's reign, and he would go on to minister through the reigns of such kings as Jehoaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah. And this was roughly a span of 40 years of prophetic ministry and labor right up to and through the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon in 586 BC. And there's probably no other writing prophet in the Hebrew Scriptures who sustained his ministry through a more volatile and devastating stretch of Israel's national history. And he preached through Josiah's reform, what we would probably call a genuine but ultimately incomplete revival. And then he watched that reform literally dissolve under the pressure of the kings who followed. And Jeremiah, he warned, he pleaded, he wept, and he proclaimed for 4 decades. He was thrown into a cistern. He was placed in stocks. His scroll was burned by a king who even refused to hear it. Even his own family and hometown turned against him, and he was accused of treason. And yet, through all of it, the word Yahweh had placed in his mouth did not stop. Jeremiah continued to speak on behalf of Yahweh. But why does all of this matter for our study of Jeremiah 6? Because the words that we are examining, they were not the hasty reaction of some young prophet who was new to the weight of his calling. They were the measured, seasoned, spirit-saturated cry of a man who had been watching Judah's drift for years, possibly even decades, and who knew with prophetic clarity where it was leading. And when he calls Judah to the ancient paths, it's not a theological suggestion. It is the last alarm, the last cry, if you will, before the gates close. And so before we move to our next main point of focus, let's just take a moment and let's look at the weeping prophet and his grief as prophetic authority. Now, Jeremiah, he's often called the weeping prophet, and it's worth pausing on why the description matters so much for the understanding of his message. Now, his tears, they were not a sign of emotional instability or weakness, as some may say. They were evidence of how deeply he was aligned with the heart of Yahweh, and Yahweh's heart toward a people who were walking toward ruin was one of profound grief. So let's look at Jeremiah 9, verse 1, where the text says, "If only my head were water and my eyes were a fountain of tears, I would weep day and night over the slain of my dear people." And friends, this is intercession, not self-pity. It's the posture of a man so thoroughly shaped by Yahweh's own grief that he cannot separate even his own emotions from Yahweh's. And when a father watches his child walk toward a cliff and refuses to stop, the grief that fills the father's heart and chest, it's not anger at first, it's love and anguish. And that's Jeremiah. And that, my friend, is Yahweh. And understanding this, it's essential for reading Jeremiah 6:16 with the proper weight and understanding of it. And so the call to the ancient paths was not issued coldly by a dispassionate legal authority. It was cried out by a broken-hearted man carrying the grief of a broken-hearted Elohim, an Elohim who had made a covenant with the people he loved, who had provided for them, protected them, disciplined them, and sent messenger after messenger, prophet after prophet to call them back, and who was now watching them refuse this one final act of mercy and invitation. And with that image of the prophet established, we can now turn to the world that he was sent into, because understanding the condition of Judah is just as essential as understanding Jeremiah himself. Now, here's what makes Judah's spiritual condition, I believe, so instructive for our own generation. The drift, it was not obvious. It wasn't a case of a nation that had just openly renounced Yahweh and set up altars to foreign gods in the public square overnight. It was something that was far more subtle and far more dangerous. A gradual, generational drift away from the prescribed ways of Yahweh, carried out under the banner of continued religion. The temple, it was still standing. The priesthood was still functioning. The sacrifices, they were still being offered. The festivals were still being observed. And on the surface, everything looked like it was working. But beneath the surface, the content of Yahweh's covenant, it had been quietly replaced. So let's begin to break this down by looking at the corruption from within, these priests and prophets who dealt falsely. Now, the corruption in Judah, it did not begin with the people in the streets. It began with the leadership, the very people whose calling it was to guard the ancient paths and to keep them clear for the nation to walk in. And the priests, who were supposed to be the keepers and the teachers of the Torah, were teaching falsely. And the prophets, who were supposed to be Yahweh's authentic voice, they were offering comfortable, consequence-free messages. And because the leadership had normalized this deviation, the people had no framework for recognizing that anything was even wrong. Let's look at Jeremiah 6, verse 13. The text says, "For from the least to the greatest of them, everyone is gaining profit dishonestly." Notice this, from prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have treated my people's brokenness superficially, claiming peace, peace, when there is no peace. And so this single phrase, I believe, peace, peace, when there is no peace, captures one of the most persistent and dangerous patterns in all of religious history. It is the voice that soothes people into spiritual complacency precisely when they need the alarm of Scripture sounding the loudest in their ears. And the false prophets of Jeremiah's day, they weren't lying about trivial things. They were lying about the most critical thing, the actual spiritual condition of the nation and the actual disposition of Yahweh toward their covenant unfaithfulness. And notice the comprehensiveness and depth of this indictment, from the least to the greatest. And so, friend, this was not a problem confined to just a few corrupt individuals. It was systemic. It was system-wide. The entire culture of religious leadership had been shaped by the same impulses, the preference for what was convenient and culturally acceptable over what Yahweh had actually prescribed. And when that kind of corruption reaches systemic levels and works its way through the entire system, the people who grow up within it have no internal alarm to tell them something is wrong. The new cart, if you will, becomes the only cart they have ever known. Let's look at 2 Timothy 4, verse 3. "For the time will come when they will not tolerate sound doctrine, but according to their own desires will multiply teachers for themselves, because they have an itch to hear something new. They will turn away from hearing the truth and will turn aside to myths." And so Paul's warning to Timothy, it describes the same dynamic Jeremiah was confronting in real time. People multiplying teachers who would tell them what they wanted to hear and turning away from the truth that made demands on them. And the appetite for these smooth words, if you will, it's never gone away, friend. And the leaders who supply smooth words to that appetite, they've never lacked an audience, and it's no different in our day. And so let's now turn our attention and look at an interesting statement about the double evil and the abandoned springs and broken cisterns. And one of the most penetrating images in all of Jeremiah's prophetic ministry comes not from chapter 6, but from chapter 2, and I believe it deserves our full attention, because it gives us the clearest possible picture of what Judah's spiritual drift actually looked like from Yahweh's perspective. So let's go to Jeremiah 2, verse 11, where the text says, "Has a nation ever exchanged its gods? But they are not gods. Yet my people have exchanged their glory for useless idols. Be horrified at this, heavens. Be shocked and utterly appalled. This is the declaration of Yahweh. For my people have committed a double evil, and they have abandoned me, the fountain of living water, and have dug cisterns for themselves, cracked cisterns that cannot hold water." And so notice this, Yahweh does not describe Judah's condition as merely just disobedience. He describes it as a double evil, not one sin, but two compounded. And first, they abandoned the fountain of living water, the self-replenishing, ever-flowing, life-giving source that is Yahweh himself, and the ways he prescribed for his people to walk in. And secondly, they actively constructed substitutes, cisterns dug by human hands to try to capture and to hold water their souls needed. And these are not ordinary cisterns. They are cracked cisterns according to the Scripture. They look functional, and they're filled with effort and intention, we might say, but they cannot hold water because the crack runs through the foundation. And this is the precise spiritual dynamic produced by every generation of New Cart religion. The move away from Yahweh's prescribed ways toward human constructed alternatives that promise to meet the same need. They may satisfy for a season, and they may even produce emotional responses and some institutional momentum, But eventually, inevitably, the crack will show itself and the water that was supposed to be there is gone. And the people who depended on those cisterns, they're left dry, confused, and wondering what went wrong. And Judah, they had been drinking from these cracked cisterns for long enough that most of the population could no longer even remember what the fountain tasted like. And so the deviation, it had just become the normal. And that normalization, friend, is precisely what brought them to the precipice Jeremiah was warning them about. So let's take a closer look at this nation that had forgotten even how to blush according to the Scripture. And so perhaps probably the most sobering and diagnostic statement in all of Jeremiah's ministry comes in the verse immediately preceding the call to the ancient paths. It is a statement that cuts to the deepest level of the problem, I believe, not what Judah was doing, but what had happened to their capacity to even recognize what they were doing. Let's look at Jeremiah 6, verse 15. Were they ashamed when they acted so abhorrently? They weren't at all ashamed. They didn't even know how to blush. Therefore, they will fall among the fallen. When I punish them, they will collapse, says Yahweh. The capacity to blush, to feel genuine shame in the presence of one's own moral and spiritual failure, is not a weakness in the biblical framework. It is the evidence of a conscience that's still calibrated by Yahweh's standard. And when shame is present, there's still a reference point, if you will. The person still knows at some level what right looks like, and the gap between that standard and their behavior produces the sensation of shame. But when shame disappears, it does not mean the person has found peace. It means the reference point, friend, is gone. And that accurately describes what we're seeing in the mainstream church of today. So how does a nation reach the point of not knowing how to even blush? I believe it happens gradually, and I believe it happens generationally, through a sustained process of teaching that normalizes deviation and reframes covenant unfaithfulness as either acceptable, progressive, or irrelevant. One generation drifts and feels sort of that twinge of shame. The next generation inherits the drift as just normal and feels much less. The third generation, they've never known anything different, and the concept of shame for these particular departures, they no longer register at all. And by the time Jeremiah was standing in the gates of Jerusalem, the people could not understand what he was so alarmed about, because from the inside, within the system, everything looked normal. The new cart had been running so long that it had become the standard. And the people who cannot perceive the deviation, they cannot experience the conviction that would otherwise lead them back. Jeremiah 6:16, I believe, is the diagnostic behind the invitation of verse 16. Yahweh called them to the ancient paths precisely because they had drifted so far from them that they could no longer see the distance even for themselves. Now, the spiritual condition that we've just examined were not occurring in isolation. They were producing, as covenant unfaithfulness always produces, a corresponding crisis in the physical and political realm. Does that sound a little bit familiar? Yahweh had been explicit about this from the very beginning of the covenant. The blessings of covenant faithfulness and the consequences of covenant unfaithfulness, they were not mysteries, friend. They were spelled out in great detail in the Torah of Moses, and Judah had this text. What was gathering on the northern horizon was not a surprise, friend. It was the harvest. So let's take a closer look at the warning Israel should have taken to heart here. Now, Jeremiah's generation had more than enough warning available to them. A century before Jeremiah's ministry, the northern kingdom of Assyria had been destroyed and its population was deported by Assyria precisely because of their covenant unfaithfulness, their idolatry, and their rejection of the prophets Yahweh sent to call them back. The 10 northern tribes were scattered in 722 BC, and the land was repopulated with foreigners. Israel's fall was on the record, and it was recent history. And Yahweh himself, through the prophet Ezekiel, who was a contemporary of Jeremiah, ministering to the exiles in Babylon, he lamented that Judah had seen what happened to her sister and still refused to change. In fact, the testimony of Scripture is that Judah had even grown more corrupt than the northern kingdom, not less. Look at 2 Chronicles 36, verse 15. Yahweh, the Elohim of their ancestors, sent word against them by the hands of his messengers, sending them time after time because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept ridiculing the messengers of Elohim, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets until Yahweh's wrath was so stirred up against his people that there was no remedy. Notice this phrase time after time. This is the phrase that reveals Yahweh's character in the midst of these events. Every prophet sent was another act of compassion and mercy. Every warning extended was another expression of Yahweh's patience. And the judgment that finally came was not failure of Yahweh's mercy. It was the exhaustion of it, we could argue, after generations of messengers sent, rejected, mocked, and silenced. Jeremiah was one of those messengers, and the call to the ancient paths in Jeremiah 6:16 is one of those expressions of great compassion delivered in the shadow of an approaching consequence. So let's look at this alarm that was sounding here in Jeremiah chapter 6. Because Jeremiah 6 does not open gently. It opens with the sound of a military alarm, evacuation orders, signal fires, and the image of a great army that was already descending from the north. And the threat was not distant or theoretical. It was Babylon, and friend, it was coming. Look at Jeremiah 6, verse 1. Flee for safety, descendants of Benjamin. Flee from Jerusalem. Blow the ram's horn in Tekoa. Light the signal fires at Beit Hakarim. For disaster looks down from the north and great destruction. Though she is beautiful and delicate, I will destroy the daughter of Zion. Shepherds will come against her with their flocks. They will pitch their tents around her. Each will graze in his own area. And notice that the signal fires in Tekoa and Bet Hakarim were being lit to the south and west of Jerusalem, suggesting, in other words, that the city was already being encircled. And the urgency of the language, it's really unmistakable here. This was not a distant possibility being warned about. The disaster was, in Jeremiah's prophetic vision here, already looking down from the horizon. The army was just over the horizon, or over the ridge, we might say. And into the middle of this alarm, Yahweh pauses, and in verse 16, he issues an invitation rather than simply an announcement. That pause is one of the most revealing moments, I believe, in all of prophetic literature. Even here, even now, even with the army in view, Yahweh is not content to just simply announce the judgment. He stretches out his hand one more time and says, there is still a way back. Stand at the crossroads. Ask for the ancient paths. Take them and find rest for your souls. And that is the Elohim whose compassion genuinely exceeds his people's capacity to exhaust it. And friend, I would argue that compassion, that mercy, it's still available today to all who will accept it and turn back to the ancient ways. But let's now turn our attention to this unusual statement that is made about the uncircumcised ear when the word becomes contemptible. And so before we arrive at the call of verse 16, there's one more what I would call a diagnostic element in Jeremiah 6 that deserves attention because it describes the specific internal condition that made Judah incapable of receiving the invitation that Yahweh was about to extend to them. So let's look at Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 10, where the scripture says, who can I speak to and give such a warning that they will listen? Look, their ear is uncircumcised, so they are unable to pay attention. Look, the word of Yahweh has become contemptible to them. They find no pleasure in it. And notice this phrase, the ear is uncircumcised. I believe this is probably one of the most powerful expressions in all of Jeremiah's prophetic vocabulary here. Physical circumcision, now think about this, was the covenant sign of belonging to Yahweh's people. It was the mark in the flesh that said, I am in relationship with Yahweh and his covenant governs my life. An uncircumcised ear is an ear that, in its deepest orientation, it's operating outside of covenant, not formally, not institutionally, but functionally. Now think about that, friend. Judah was formally part of the entire house of Israel, and Judah belonged to Yahweh's covenant people, and Judah was formally observing the religious forms, but in the place where it mattered most, in their interest to the actual specific word of Yahweh, they were functionally operating as the covenant did not exist. And does that not sound familiar today? I would argue that it does. And then comes a statement that's really almost unbelievable had it not been recorded in the scriptures. The word of Yahweh had become contemptible to them. They found no pleasure in it. And this is the end state of a people who have been fed smooth words for far too long. And when the authentic voice of Yahweh finally comes, specific, demanding, calling for genuine change, it does not sound like what they've been conditioned to receive. It's uncomfortable. It's costly. And a people formed by decades of comfortable, consequence-free, peace preaching experience the genuine word of Yahweh not as life, but as an intrusion to be rejected. And this is why part 3 of this series is focused entirely to the context. We need to understand the condition of Judah not merely as some historical background, but as a diagnostic mirror, if you will. And the question is not whether these patterns existed in Jeremiah's day. The question, friend, is this: whether we have the honesty and the courage to hold that mirror up to our own generation, communities, lives, assemblies, doctrines, and systems. Now, there's one more dimension of Jeremiah's crisis that I believe we must examine before we're really ready to stand at the crossroads of verse 16, and that is the foundational theological principle that explains why the crisis even existed and why the invitation to the ancient paths was so urgent. Now, the disaster coming up on Judah was not arbitrary divine anger. It was not Yahweh acting on impulse or being excessive. It was, in the language of Jeremiah 6:19, the fruit of their own plotting, the inevitable harvest of choices made across generations within the explicit framework of a covenant that they had agreed to. And so let's notice how this was a covenant with declared consequences. And so from the very moment that Yahweh established his covenant with Israel at Sinai, and again in the renewal of that covenant in Deuteronomy, he had been extremely transparent about how it worked. There was no ambiguity, no hidden clauses, no fine print, we would say. He had set before them life and death, blessing and curse, and he had tied those outcomes directly and explicitly to their faithfulness or their unfaithfulness to his covenant instructions. Let's look at Deuteronomy 28, verse 1, where the scripture says, "Now if you faithfully obey Yahweh your Elohim and are careful to follow all his commands I am giving you today, Yahweh your Elohim will put you far above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings will come and overtake you because you obey Yahweh your Elohim." Deuteronomy 28:15 says, "But if you do not obey Yahweh your Elohim, by carefully following his commands and statutes I am giving you today, all these curses will come and overtake you." And so what follows in Deuteronomy 28 is an extremely detailed and historically specific list of consequences, many of which chart with great precision onto exactly what Jeremiah witnessed happening to Judah in his generation. An invasion from a distant nation, siege of the cities, devastation of the land, there was exile of the people, and these were not unforeseen surprise events. They were the covenant curses that Moses had described nearly a millennium earlier, now ripening in real time right before Jeremiah's eyes. And this theological framework, if you will, is what makes Jeremiah's call to the ancient paths, I believe, so urgent. The consequences that are bearing down on Judah were not Yahweh acting without warning or reason. They were Yahweh being faithful to the covenant terms that he had established from the very beginning. He had warned, he had waited, he had sent prophet after prophet, and now through Jeremiah, he was making one final appeal before the terms of the covenant ran their course. And the ancient paths were not merely spiritually preferable. Walking in them was literally the difference between life and death. So let's notice the patience that preceded this storm here. Because one of the most overlooked aspects, I believe, of the entire Jeremiah narrative is what it reveals about the patience of Yahweh. Jeremiah himself ministered for more than 40 years. But the prophetic tradition that he stood in, it stretched back much further. Generation after generation, Yahweh had been sending watchmen, prophets, if you will, to call his people back. And he had not brought immediate judgment at the first deviation. He extended extreme patience, sending messenger after messenger, prophet after prophet, to sound the alarm and to extend the invitation to return. And the writer of 2 Chronicles, he summarizes this pattern, I believe, with some great clarity here, describing what happened in the period leading up to the final fall of Jerusalem. Look at 2 Chronicles 36:15. Yahweh, the Elohim of their ancestors, sent word against them by the hand of his messengers, sending them time after time, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept ridiculing the messengers of Elohim, despising his words, and scoffing at his prophets, until Yahweh's wrath was so stirred up against his people that there was no remedy. And notice that phrase, time after time. And this phrase, I believe, is the answer to the question that every generation eventually asks, is why didn't Yahweh stop them sooner? Why did he let the drift continue for so long before he brought judgment? And the answer is that he did not let it continue silently. He was sending messenger after messenger, time after time, in expression after expression of his compassion, because he did not want the harvest they were planting. Every prophet was an act of mercy. Every warning, it was an extension of the invitation to return. The judgment that finally came, it was not evidence of a failure of his patience. It was evidence that his patience, as great as it was, could not be refused forever without consequences. So let's look at this warning that reaches across every generation, I believe. The theological principle that's embedded in Jeremiah's crisis, drift from the ancient paths, prophetic warning, invitation to return, refusal, and the inevitable harvest of covenant consequences, it's not a principle that's confined to ancient Judah. It is the consistent pattern of every generation of Yahweh's people that trades his prescribed ways for a more convenient path of cultural accommodation and religious innovation. And the prophet Hosea, speaking to the northern kingdom before its fall to Assyria, identified the same root cause that Jeremiah would later confront in Judah. Look at Hosea 4:6. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will reject you from serving as my priest. Since you have forgotten the instruction of your Elohim, I will also forget your sons. And notice this phrase, forgotten the instructions of your Elohim. And the Hebrew word here for instructions is Torah. And so the rejection of Yahweh's Torah, it's never theologically neutral. It always carries consequences in the generation that rejects it and the generations that inherit that deceit. And so Hosea's word to the northern kingdom before its fall and Jeremiah's word to the southern kingdom before its fall, I believe, speak with a single voice. The ancient paths are not one option among many. They are the way back to life. And every departure from them, no matter how gradual, however well-intentioned, however widely accepted, carries within it the seed of the fruit both prophets watched ripen in their day. And this is not a message of condemnation delivered from a cold, detached distance. It is the most compassionate thing that a watchman can say. The path that you're on leads somewhere specific, and Yahweh has been transparent from the beginning about where this path leads. And so understanding this principle, understanding what it cost Judah to refuse the ancient paths, is what will give us ears to truly hear the invitation Jeremiah extends in verse 16. And that invitation to stand, to look, to ask for the ancient paths, to take those paths and find rest for your souls is precisely where we will pick up in part 4. We will unpack each of these 4 commands that we briefly introduced in part 2 and examine the promises of rest that accompany them and address the new covenant directly from its own definition in Jeremiah 31 and draw an honest and practical lines of application for what returning to the ancient paths look like for those of us living in this generation. So friend, don't miss part 4. And so, friends, I just want to close today's teaching with an observation that I believe is worth sitting with between now and part 4. Everything we've examined today, the prophet's calling, Judah's condition, the gathering storm, and the theological principle of covenant consequence, all of it is context. It is the world in which Yahweh speaks the 6 words of Jeremiah 6:16, stand by the roadways and look. And before he issues the invitation, he made sure there was a prophet brokenhearted enough to cry it out. And before he offered the ancient paths as the alternative, he let the consequences of leaving them become visible. And before he said, take it and find rest, he allowed the exhaustion of the cracked cisterns to be felt. And Yahweh does not invite people to return to the ancient path from the comfort of a place where the deviation is invisible. He invites them from the edge of the consequences, from the place where what the new cart religion produces has become undeniable. And when he points to the crossroads and says, the ancient paths are still there, the good way is still acceptable, you can stand, you can ask, you can look, you can take it, you can still find rest for your souls. And friend, the invitation is as alive today as it was in Jeremiah's generation. Part 4 will open it up in full. But until then, let the context that we've examined today do its work. Let it be the mirror to assess where we are now, and let it make you hungry for those ancient paths, and let it prepare you to hear the call with the urgency that I believe it deserves. And so let's just summarize what we've covered here today very quickly before we wrap this video up. So in part 3, we've laid the essential groundwork for understanding one of the most significant passages, I believe, in all of the Hebrew prophets, Jeremiah 6, verses 16 through 19. And before we could stand at the crossroads of Jeremiah's call, we need to understand the prophet who was sent to make that call, the people he was sent to, and the crisis that made this call so urgent. And we began with Jeremiah himself, appointed before birth, commissioned over nations and kingdoms, called not to comfort but to confront, and sustained through more than 40 years of painful, largely unheeded ministry by the word Yahweh had placed in his mouth. His tears was authenticated by his message. They told us that this was not a theological exercise, but this was a broken-hearted prophet carrying a broken-hearted Elohim's grief over a people that he loved. We then examined the spiritual condition of Judah from the inside, the systemic corruption of priests and prophets who dealt falsely and declared peace, peace, when there was no peace, the double evil of abandoning Yahweh as the fountain of living water while constructing cracked cisterns of their own devising, and the most sobering diagnostic of all, I believe, a generation that had drifted so far from the ancient paths that they no longer knew how to blush. The deviation had become the normal, and the normal had become invisible. We then turned to the storm gathering on the northern horizon, the Babylonian threat that was not an arbitrary punishment, but the covenant consequences of choices made across generations, and within the explicit framework of Deuteronomy 28. We saw the extraordinary patience of Yahweh in the face of the drift, sending messenger after messenger, prophet after prophet, time after time, in expression after expression of his compassion. And we heard Hosea's confirmation that the rejection of Torah knowledge always carries generational consequence. And all of this is the world into which Yahweh speaks the invitation of Jeremiah 6:16. And so in part 4, we will stand at the crossroads together and unpack each of these 4 commands that Yahweh gives. Stand, look, ask, take it. Receive the promise of rest that accompanies them, and draw clear and honest application for those of us who are actually willing and walking in this generation. So be sure to join us for part 4. And so friends, before we sign off, let me say a genuine thank you to each of you who took the time to be with us in today's teaching. We don't take that lightly at the Berean way, and we're truly grateful for every person who is walking this road with us, because they seem to be few and far between. And so if today's teaching stirred something in you, the most helpful thing that you can do is share it with someone else who is asking the same questions. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, turn on the notifications so that you don't miss part 4, and pass it along to a friend. Every one of those actions genuinely help this content reach more people. And for those of you who have asked about supporting the channel in a greater way, we do have a Buy Me a Coffee account, and the link to that, it's in the description box below. And if you feel led, we're grateful, and everything given, it goes straight back into the work here at the channel. And so if you have any questions or thoughts from today's teaching, you can reach out at the Berean Way 1711 at gmail.com. We genuinely love hearing from our listeners and viewers, or you can leave us a comment on the video or on our social media pages. And so part 4, it's coming, and we strongly believe the call to the ancient paths, heard in the full light of everything we've examined today, it's going to land a little bit differently than it would have without this foundation. So don't miss it. But until then, be a Berean, walk in the Berean way, and may Yahweh Shalom find you in your pursuit of biblical truth.